Over the past 3 nights we've been going through Anatalakkhana Sutta, looking at more profound aspects of the teaching, that aspect of the teaching that the Buddha did not mention until he had an audience of very mature practitioners. And tonight, for a bit of a change, we'll talk about cooking, because cooking is very important. And in fact, meditation and cooking have a lot in common, or at least the Buddha thought so. This is what he explained in Suddha Sutta, the cook. Bhikkhus, suppose a foolish, incompetent, unskillful cook were to present a king or royal minister with various kinds of curries, sour, bitter, pungent, sweet, sharp, mild, salty and bland. That foolish, incompetent, unskillful cook does not pick up the sign of his own master's preference. Today this curry pleased my master, or he reached for this one, or he took a lot of this one, or he spoke in praise of this one. That foolish, incompetent, unskillful cook does not gain clothing, wages and bonuses. Why? Because that foolish, incompetent, unskillful cook does not pick up the sign of his master's preference. So the Buddha is talking about cooking and what makes for a bad cook, which is obviously very important to him. This particular cook is not impressed with foolish, incompetent, unskillful. The unskillful is akusala. Usually when the Buddha uses the term kusala, skillful or wholesome, akusala, unskillful, unwholesome, he's using it in terms of ethics. Something is ethical if it's kusala, something is unethical if it's akusala. Here he's using this word in relation to cooking. He also uses the term foolish, bala, which could also be translated as childish. So you have a cook. Now this cook is a top-level chef. He cooks for a king or a royal minister. Let's in this case say cooking for a restaurant, preparing all these various kinds of dishes for the customers. What makes for a foolish, incompetent, unskillful cook is he does not pick up the sign of his own master's preference, or in this case the customer's preference. Does not pick up the sign of the customer's preference. Now the word sign here is nimitta. And those of you who are familiar with Theravada Buddhist literature on meditation know that the nimitta is very important in meditation. If you're doing serenity meditation and you just want absorption, you just want samadhi, and you're not worried about insight, as you concentrate, the nimitta arises within the mind. And the nimitta can take different forms. Those of you who might have done retreats with Ajahn Brahms, he talks about the nimitta. Sometimes it's visual, people will see lights, or it might be something else. But whatever it is, you then focus on that, and then it takes you into absorption, into jhana. Nimitta is a technical term used in meditation. Here it's a technical term used in catering. So obviously catering and meditation, again, have a lot in common. A sign or signal, nimitta could be translated as signal, is always something which indicates something else. You have signs on the road. You might have numbers, 110, meaning that's the speed limit. Don't travel more than 110 kilometres an hour, and preferably not too much below it, because otherwise you'll cause chaos. That's a nimitta, a sign, or a street sign is a nimitta, or instructions on a packet of something is a nimitta. What a nimitta does is it points you towards something. It indicates something. In the case of serenity meditation, it points to samadhi, what will take you into deeper concentration. In insight meditation, there is also a nimitta, which takes you into absorption, But in insight meditation, the nimitta, there are actually 3 nimittas. Can you guess what they are? Because there's 3 of them. It's pretty obvious. Anicca, dukkha, anatta. This is the nimitta that arises in the course of meditation, and these nimittas will take you into absorption, concentration, which leads to nibbana, as distinct from jhana. This is one reason why we've been talking about the importance of these characteristics, finding or noticing change. We talked about how in Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha will start off, the practitioner lives tracking body as body, and then later on in the chorus he will say, the practitioner lives tracking the nature of arising as body, the nature of ceasing as body, the nature of arising and ceasing as body. So here he's talking about the nimitta. The nimitta of impermanence has now become the meditation object. So different styles of meditation practice will manifest in different ways. And different things are important. It seems often when I come to Malaysia to teach retreats, meditators are obsessed about seeing visions, lights especially. I've had meditators come in halfway through the retreat. Oh, it's terrible. I'm not making any progress. I'm hopeless. I'm a failure. It's awful. And I say, what's the problem? What's the problem? Because it seems to me to be going fine. And the meditator says, I'm still not seeing any lights. When did I say you're supposed to see lights? But no, everybody is seeing lights, and so you're supposed to see lights. If you're doing serenity meditation, the lights may be significant. So you may, okay, the light has arisen, now I want to focus in on it, I want to stabilize it, and that's going to take me further. If you're doing insight meditation, the light is important only insofar as it demonstrates anicca, dukkha, anatta. Otherwise, it's completely irrelevant. Because the nimitta in insight meditation is different. So you have different styles of meditation practice where different things are important. Now here, the Buddha is using the same word, nimitta, but in a completely different way. Here he's using it about reading the preferences of the customer. So you have the chef in the kitchen, cooking up the meal. The waiter comes in, takes it, off he goes. And then the chef relaxes in the kitchen and smokes a cigarette. Is this a good chef? The Buddha is saying, no. The chef should be studying the customer. The chef should be reading the customer. Learning to read the customer like a book. Actually, this is important in catering. My father ran a small catering business, a barbecue business. He used to cook barbecues for people. Outdoor catering. So a certain amount of PR work with the customers was important. He used to like drinking lots of alcohol, and the customers used to like drinking lots of alcohol. And one day I saw him once when a customer came up with a special wine. He had this bottle of wine and he was holding it like a treasured possession. And he says, Jerry, I want you to taste this and tell me what you think. So he pours in a little bit. My father takes the glass and he swirls it around and he studies the colour and he sniffs it. And he's in deep absorption, deep samadhi. And he tastes the wine. And he said something to the customer, and the customer was really happy. He goes off. And I was looking at this whole thing and I thought, my father was not tasting the wine. He was tasting the customer. He told that fellow exactly what that fellow wanted to hear. And this is something that my father had been working on for a long time. If you run a small business, that's what you do. You've got to read the customer. It's no good having all this stuff in the shop, and if the customer walks in and looks at it, walks out, and you ignore it. In Brisbane, in West End, where I live, there's lots of little cafes. It's a big catering area. And this new cafe opened. And I was very interested because I like good coffee. And in the local paper, the owners, a young couple, they made a public vow that every single cup of coffee served in that cafe, one of the two owners would make. Only they would be trusted with making the coffee. So I thought, this has got to be good. So I checked it out, and it was the best coffee in Brisbane. I was talking about this to a couple of friends of mine who are very picky about their food. And they went there one day to check it out to have lunch. Now, the cafe right beside this other place was always packed. It was always really, really crowded. People would come in there and eat, and it was always crowded. I don't think I ever ate a meal there because there was never a vacant seat when I passed. Anyway, my friends go to this new place next door, and they pick their meal and they eat the meal, and the young owner comes up afterwards and says, "What did you think?" And my friends look at each other and think, should we tell him? Well, he asked. And they say, well, we weren't so impressed by it because blah, blah, blah. And the owner looked a bit disappointed. My friend said, if you want to do well here, check out next door's menu. I mean, they're doing well. And off they went. They didn't think much of it. But a week later, they came back to that cafe, sat down, looked at the menu. It was completely different. It was much more like next door's. And the food was very good, and the fellow got customers. So here was a cafe owner who was genuinely interested in what his customers said. Usually when people ask you, they're not really interested. And so you say something polite. But he was interested. He was sincere. He would serve you a cup of coffee, and he would come up and he would ask what you thought of it, and he wanted to hear. He read the sign of his customer's preference. So the Buddha would tick him off as a good cook and a good barista. How is this relevant to us? The Buddha goes on, so too, bhikkhus, here some foolish, incompetent, unskillful bhikkhu lives tracking body as body, ardent, clearly understanding, mindful, surrendering desire and grief for the world. While he lives tracking body as body, his mind does not become concentrated or unified. His corruptions are not abandoned. He does not pick up that sign. He lives tracking feeling as feeling, mind as mind, phenomena as phenomena. While he lives tracking phenomena as phenomena, his mind does not become unified. His corruptions are not abandoned. He does not pick up that sign. So now he switches from cooking to meditation. And the foolish, incompetent, unskillful bhikkhu, or in this case, let's just say meditator. The Buddha is very forceful in his language. I've never in the interview room said, you are a foolish, incompetent, unskillful meditator. But obviously the bhikkhu was, the Buddha was more direct in his language. What is this foolish, incompetent, unskillful meditator doing? This meditator is living, tracking body as body, ardent, clearly understanding, mindful, surrendering desire and grief for the world. What is wrong with that? This is exactly the standard formula for everything that the meditator should do. This is a hard-working meditator who is following the instructions and doing everything. She's sitting, she's walking, listening carefully to the Dharma talks, listening carefully to the instructions, doing everything. And yet, the Buddha says, hopeless, foolish, incompetent, unskillful. Why are you wasting my time? What is wrong? What's missing? She's not getting the result. Her mind does not become unified. Her corruptions are not abandoned. But the reason is, this third bit, she does not pick up that sign. There's something that she's missing. There's something that she should be reading, but isn't. What is this all about? That foolish, incompetent, unskillful bhikkhu does not gain pleasant dwellings in this very life. And this is be reference to concentration, samadhi. Nor does he gain mindfulness and clear understanding. For what reason? Because that foolish, incompetent, unskillful bhikkhu does not pick up the sign of his own mind. This is the sign that we need as meditators to be reading. Suppose a wise, competent, skillful cook were to present a king or royal minister with various kinds of curries: sour, bitter, pungent, sweet, sharp, mild, salty and bland. That wise, competent, skillful cook picks up the sign of his own master's preference. Today this curry pleased my master, or he reached for this one, or he took a lot of this one, or he spoke in praise of this one. That wise, competent, skillful cook gains clothing, wages and bonuses. Why? Because that wise, competent, skillful cook picks up the sign of his master's preference. So the good cook reads the customer. The good cook is not satisfied with having followed the recipe. Maybe it's necessary. Cooks are different. Some cooks religiously follow the recipe. Other cooks glance at the recipe and do their own thing. Some cooks follow the recipe, but they change something. My wife and I are cooking at home. I hasten to add I'm the assistant and she's the executive. When she's cooking, making a dessert, if the recipe says X amount of sugar, she'll just immediately reduce it to about maybe 1/10, and even then not use sugar but use some other sweetening. Being creative with the recipe. I won't follow it like this, I'll just change it at this point. This seems better to me. So there's different styles of cooking. But ultimately, whatever style you use, what is it that is important? Chomp, chomp, chomp. That's important. That's the test. What does it taste like? What's the effect of eating it? So too, here, some wise, competent, skillful bhikkhu lives contemplating body as body, ardent, clearly understanding, mindful, surrendering desire and grief regarding the world. Now you notice that this meditator is doing exactly the same thing as the other meditator, following exactly the same recipe. While he lives tracking body as body, his mind becomes unified, his corruptions are abandoned, he picks up that sign. That wise, competent, skillful bhikkhu gains pleasant dwellings in this very life, and he gains mindfulness and clear understanding. Why? Because that wise, competent, skillful bhikkhu picks up the sign of his own mind. In cooking, it's reading the customer, and everything relates to that. You modify the recipe according to the customer. You don't rigidly stick to the recipe, regardless of what the customer responds. If you're creative and free-flowing, I don't want to be tied down by recipes, I just want to be a creative genius in the kitchen. Well, you do it, and you read the customer. And it's the customer's response that validates what you are doing in the kitchen. And if the customer's response is, "Ugh, I don't like that," you change what you're doing. It's simple. You read the customer. In the meditation practice, we read our own mind. It doesn't matter if we're obeying orders. It doesn't matter if we are religiously following the correct technique. People often ask, they say, "I was doing such and such. Is that right? Is that the right thing? Is that what I should be doing?" In other words, is this part of the recipe? Now, it's a valid question. But sometimes I ask back, does it work? In other words, well, what does your mind say? Is your mind becoming unified? Are you abandoning the corruptions by doing this or not? What we, as meditators, as practitioners, we need to learn how to read our own mind. And this is essential to the whole process. Now, this is not something that we can do immediately. When we start, we don't know. We don't know how to read our own mind. We don't know what the signs are. We don't know what the signs mean. Through a mixture of experience, step by step by step, you go through it, and also the information you're getting from the talks and the instructions in the interviews and the advice, you start to pick up what's important, what's not, what indicates what. You start to learn how to read the sign of your own mind. And in this way you develop a skill. It's not a question of being a meditation robot. Lift, move, place. Lift, move, place. Rise, fall. Rise, fall. Lift, move, place. There's a creativity in it. Now, meditators like cooks are different. Some meditators follow the recipe. And they do that very carefully. The instructions help. It really helps to have to be told exactly what to do. And they do. They follow the recipe. Other meditators glance at the recipe and throw it out and start to cook. Some meditators are much more creative in the way that they approach the practice. And there's all the variations in between. Now, there's nothing wrong with any of these styles. All of them can work. All of them cannot work. The question is the meditator reading the sign of her own mind? Is she developing that capacity? That is absolutely central. That's what's really important. And it happens gradually. Again, it's not something that you start with. At first you don't know. Meditation is not magic. It doesn't simply work because we're sitting on the cushion. Just sitting here is not enough. There is no cosmic reward for sitting on a cushion for a long period of time. It's necessary to develop a skill while we are doing this practice. That is what's important. And the Buddha here is talking about this in terms of learning to read one's own mind. So what is happening to me? When I practice like this, what happens? If I change to that, what happens? And so we take responsibility for what we're doing. That's one of the reasons why in this retreat we have the independent schedule. It throws it even more onto the individual meditator. How much sitting should I do? How long should I sit? How much walking? How much daily activity? These are questions which ultimately only the practitioner can answer, because only the practitioner can read the sign of her own mind. This is an important, an essential part of learning meditation practice. And I think we can say that everybody here is in fact better at reading the sign of their own mind tonight than they were when they arrived. This is what's called progress. Progress is not measured in spectacular experiences. Some people do a retreat and nothing in particular happens. Other people do a retreat and they have the most huge, spectacular experiences. And if they're talking later, I had this profound this, that and the other. What happened to you? Well, I sat there and breathed, really. It doesn't follow that the person with the big experience has made more progress. The question is, between those two, which one is more skillful at reading the sign of their own mind? That's much more important. So we've looked at this in terms of different styles of meditation practice. Sometimes we might focus in narrowly upon a single meditation object, like this rising movement of the abdomen, that falling movement of the abdomen, and just forget everything else and really focus down. Sometimes we might open up and note the entire universe. Sometimes in the walking meditation we walk really slowly. Sometimes in the walking meditation we walk really quickly. Sometimes we have the body as meditation object. Sometimes we might have the mind as meditation object. All these possibilities are there. It's like being in the kitchen, well equipped. You've got a library of cookbooks. You could pick any cookbook You could go to any recipe. They're all different. But on top of that, you could ignore all of them and just create some dish of your own. There's infinite possibilities. So we use our creativity. The meditation method is the cookbook, or you could say the recipe, or it might be a cookbook with a whole number of recipes. And the recipes are really useful to get started. If you're not familiar with kitchens, a friend of mine advised me about how to cook. What you do is you pick about 8 or 10 recipes and you learn them by religiously following them exactly until you've got them memorized point by point. If they are the right recipe, you can't go wrong. So that's one way of cooking. Other people are quite different. There's all these different styles, and there's not one correct style. Sometimes people talk about the correct meditation method. There's one method of doing meditation. If you don't do this method, which happens to be my method, then of course you cannot expect enlightenment. It makes as much sense as saying there is one correct way to cook, and it happens to be the one that I do. If someone said that to you, would you take them seriously? No, of course not. Why should we take people seriously who say there's one correct meditation method? But it's important, if we're starting from the beginning, it really helps to be guided by the cookbook. So if we're starting a meditation practice, it really helps to have a method and to follow that method and to see where it takes us. In the method that we've been using, we've been talking about, in particular, primary object, secondary object, the basic structure. It gives us a way of structuring attention, and it also gives us a language with which to talk about meditation. Someone comes into the interview and I want to find out, well, what's happening when you meditate? What I might ask is, when you sit, what is your primary object? It's a way of finding out, well, what is it that you're primarily concerned with when you meditate? And the student, hopefully, knows what I'm talking about. Sometimes I'm shocked when halfway through a retreat I say to someone, what is your primary object? And the person says, what? And so you could talk about, well, the primary object did this, and then for secondary object, this happened. And we can both understand what we're talking about. This helps the process of reading the sign of one's own mind. And then we've been using language like mindfulness, samadhi, unification or concentration, effort. These are like the ingredients. So how much effort were you putting in? I put in a lot. What did it taste like? Or last couple of days I've really been not straining, I've just been relaxing and opening up. I just put a pinch of effort, but not much. So what does it taste like when that happens? The meditator is both the cook and the customer. It's a dual role. So what does it taste like? And the important thing is, what does it taste like? Get a feel for that. We develop a language so we can talk about the process, and so that we can understand each other when we're speaking, and also so that the meditator can look into her own mind and get a sense of what this is. Get a way of languaging, of speaking about what's happening here. Then you get a sense of what are the ingredients of this experience. So you can taste the experience and work out the ingredients. And from that, you can decide, I need a bit more of this and a bit less of that. And as a result, develop a skill. We become more skilled as practitioners. We touched upon this when we were talking about the four satipatthanas. We talked about the fourth satipatthana, the Dharma, the tracking of the Dharma. So Dharma here is the framework. In a sense, it's the recipe of recipes, the cookbook of cookbooks. We learn something about that, and that helps us understand what is it that I'm doing, and gives us a way of communicating what I experience as the result. This process, hopefully in the interviews, is refined as I learn to communicate what my experience is and what I'm doing, what my practice is, and I listen to the feedback from the teacher. We've been doing this meditation retreat over these past days. Tomorrow it's all over, we go home. And then we get a completely different style of meditation practice. Retreats are special. They're a kind of combination of sheltered workshop and boot camp. Here we have special conditions, and we do an intensive training under special conditions. We get to see what's going on in our own minds much more clearly than normal. Then we go home, and very quickly we're just as foggy and confused as we were before we came. Don't be too disappointed. Don't be surprised by it, because the conditions are completely different. And the taste comes from the conditions. Now what that means is we realise we have to reconstruct the recipe. The recipe that we had back at SBS, we cannot do. Now partly it's because the SBS kitchen is much better than the kitchen we've got at home. We can't reproduce this kitchen. And we haven't got the full range of ingredients. What to do? Well, we could give up and just go to a restaurant. Or we could decide, well, I've learnt something about the art of cooking at SBS. Now I'm going to apply it to this kitchen. And what we do is we start to invent our own recipe. There's something about ordinary everyday meditation practice that sets it apart from retreat practice. In retreat practice, there's the depth that we can't get at home because of conditions. But there's also a degree of uniformity. Like we're doing pretty much the same thing. But at home, you're on your own. It's necessarily much more creative and unpredictable. So this capacity to read the sign of your own mind becomes even more important. How should you meditate? There are some basic guidelines that all the recipes and all the cookbooks include. One is do a formal meditation practice as regularly as possible, preferably every day. The amount of time is not as important as regularity. It's like learning a musical instrument or learning a sport. It's better to spend 10 minutes every day than 2 hours once a week. You learn more that way. So regularity is really important. You set a time that you know you can manage, and you stick to it as regularly as possible. The other aspect is mindfulness in ordinary everyday activity. Most of life is ordinary everyday activity, very, very ordinary. This is one reason why we've been talking about the importance of mindfulness in daily activity in this retreat centre. The importance of this was really driven home to me when I did so far the one and only retreat I've ever done with Sayadaw U Tejaniya. This was in Perth some years ago. The really radical thing was he did not insist on noble silence. And some of the meditators took this to be licence to talk as much as possible and as loudly as possible and as often as possible. There was one particular group of meditators all the way through the retreat, blah, 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 blah. It was just driving everybody else completely crazy. Now this talking was focused in the dining hall. It was pandemonium in there. It was so noisy. And the Sayadaw started receiving complaints. The first thing he did was he moved his own eating table into the hall. So he ate with the students, hoping that this would calm them down. And it worked for about between 2 and 3 minutes. Finally, he got up in the dining hall and he made it this speech. And he said, I am not going to tell you to stop talking. I am not going to do it. One of the hardest things to be mindful of is speech. If you can't practice mindful speech here, how on earth can you expect to do it out there? So I'm not going to tell you to stop talking, but I'm asking you to be mindful when you speak. And I was really impressed. He was so determined on this principle that he was willing to allow this complete chaos to threaten to overwhelm the whole retreat rather than give up on this principle. It was interesting. If we can't do it here, how are we going to do it in the so-called real world? So the daily activity is so important. Mindfulness of daily activity here. Because when we go back, that will be our main practice. It's a difficult practice to begin with, but it's very, very difficult if it's not supported by a regular dipping into the formal meditation each day. Now this regular meditation, sometimes it is chaos. Sometimes I find myself caught up in think, rush, plan. It's time to meditate. I sit down on the cushion, get into the posture. I've got the altar ranged. I've got the incense burning. I've got the special meditation gear. I'm all set. I sit there and it's think, rush, plan. And it just doesn't even slow down as I sit there. And so it's easy to think this is a waste of time. I may as well not bother. It's really important to sit there and experience rush, talk, plan. It's really important and it's very, very useful to give yourself the time and the space to sit there, the body is still, and you just experience all this madness. It's a very important practice. If you were doing it here, you'd be very disappointed. But if you do it at home, it's great. It's a very useful practice. So you do that and the daily activity. And keep coming back to it. We've been talking about mindfulness. Mindfulness is memory. I remember. I am already aware. I'm already seeing. I'm already hearing, tasting, touching, minding, thinking. The opposite of mindfulness is forgetfulness. Suddenly I forget. And then later I remember. And then I forget. And then I remember. And then I forget. And then I remember. If we're doing a retreat and we're doing really, really well with the samadhi, what we find is the pattern is we forget and then we remember. Forget, remember. Forget, remember. Forget, remember. If we're at home and we've got no samadhi and there's total chaos in our everyday living, the pattern is we forget, remember, forget, remember, forget, remember, forget, remember. Now do you notice that the pattern is exactly the same? The difference is the periods of forgetting are bigger and the periods of remembering are smaller. So I remember, and that memory is already mindfulness. I just want to extend it until I forget again. I could think myself into discouragement. I've actually forgotten for 6 months. Not 6 seconds, but for 6 months. Okay, so what is that? That's 6 months. In the moment of remembering, what is that 6 months? It's the past. It does not exist. It's just a story. Blah, 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 blah. That's all it is. It does not exist. What exists is this. Now, this act of remembering. I am already back on track. Any thoughts that I have about how useless it is because of all that time in the past, what's useless are these thoughts. I just continue. Forget, remember, forget, remember, forget, remember. That's the pattern. So I just keep doing it. And I find that over time, a momentum builds up. And throughout this, as with the retreat practice, I'm learning to read the sign of my own mind. I'm studying my own mind. How does this mind work in my everyday life? When does it lose itself in thought or in emotion? When is it moved to do bad, unskillful things? When is it moved to do good, skillful things? How is it moved? I study the mind, how the mind unfolds. And I learn to read the sign of my own mind. When we're working with meditation practice, there is a creative element to it. Meditation is a craft. There's certain basic drills, certain basic routines that are very useful to learn. But they essentially just get us started. Once we start working on something, and if we're working on a craft, we're solving some practical problem in order to make this whatever I'm making. So we're always working on a problem. And then we solve it. So we've learned something. There's a skill that's developed. But as soon as we solve one problem, it exposes another problem that we have to work on. So we work on that. And as soon as we resolve that problem, it reveals another problem. So we work on that. Sometimes we're so close to the process, all we can see is the problem, and we think, I'm not making much progress. But then when we stop and look back and we start to read the sign of our own mind, we start to see, no, actually, I'm much better at this than I used to be. I've got a much clearer idea of what I'm doing and how it works. Gradually, through a combination of study, through conversation, through the actual practice itself, we learn to read our own minds. And we get better at the meditation practice as a result. It takes time, and we have to be patient, but the direction in which we are going is one of greater and greater independence. Because fundamentally, the only person who can read my own mind is me. I have to learn it for myself. Others can help, but fundamentally, I have to do it. When you approach meditation practice, approach it as learning a craft. When you get good enough at the craft, it turns into an art form, and you become an artist of your own mind, an artist of your own life. And you can create something with that life, which before you might never have imagined possible. But it begins with the basics of the craft. We follow the recipe, but we keep reading the customer's responses. And we go back and forth between the recipe and the customer. We go back and forth between the craft of meditation and the reading of our own minds. And we learn that gradually over a period of time. It does take time because when we begin, we don't know. In fact, usually we have misinformation. Usually we start with the wrong idea and we have to unlearn certain things before we can really get going. But over time, we become more skillful and more independent in what we are doing, and we become better practitioners, and we start to see the difference in our own lives. And, as I said, at the end of this retreat, all of us are better at this meditation practice than we were when we arrived. So when you go home, you're taking that skill with you. And then you just keep working on it. And so you continue to develop the skill. And then when you come back to do it the next retreat, you move on to the next level. And we get better and better at it as we go. If we are practicing a physical skill, we reach a point where we can't get any better, and at a certain age we start to get worse. With this craft, with the craft of meditation, it doesn't matter how old we get. We can get better and better and better and better and better at it. The younger we start, the better, obviously. But it doesn't matter how old we are, when we start, because the longer that we live, the better we will get. And so the real skill in the art of meditation will be the art of dying. That will really be a test for reading the sign of our own mind. And if we can die well, then we've had a successful career as a meditator.